Hi, this is Carrie Brownstein.
This is DJ Premier.
This is Darren Aronofsky.
You got the RZA right here.
Rose McGowan.
Radiohead.
Aisha Tyler.
Tribe Called Quest. Fred Armisen.
Prince Paul.
Javier Munoz. Seth Meyers.
Frankie Cosmos.
Flying Lotus.
Hi, we're Chaim, and you're listening to the Talk House podcast.
What's up? What is up? It's your host, Elia Einhorn. Welcome back to the show. We have an episode that I am so excited to share with you. Two singer-songwriter/authors, Jehnny Beth, lead singer of Savages, who has struck out wonderfully on her own, and Hval. Jehnny Beth has a fantastic new LP out, as well as a book of erotic fiction that's called Calm, which stands for Crimes Against Love Memories. I could think of no artist whose aesthetic so closely jives with Jehnny Beth's than Norwegian dark wave conceptualist Hval. She released an LP late last year and recently dropped the single Bonus Material. Hval's second book comes out later this year. Now, listeners, I need to tell you about the thinking behind this pairing. Not only are these two artists hugely conceptual, I'm telling you, their work comes with artist statements, but they are also somehow each quite visceral. In their music and books, they've each brilliantly dissected the multiplicity of sexuality, gender, violence, anger, identity, and love. As I was thinking about the intro to today's show, I kept thinking, who understands the darkness, the cerebral and conceptual elements that Jehnny Beth and Hval are working in better than Nika Rosa Danilova, a.k.a. Zola Jesus? Nika, welcome back to the Talk House.
Thank you so much for having me.
Nika has, of course, been on the show previously in conversation with Circuit des Yeux' Haley 4, and on the written side of the Talk House has opined about Bauhaus, conversed with Devin Welsh, he of Magical Clouds, pondered Olga Bell's work, and much, much more. The most recent Zola Jesus LP is 2018's Okovi Editions. Nika, where are you joining us from today?
I am currently in the woods in northern Wisconsin.
You've made your home there. You are leading the Midwestern Goth Charge.
I'm trying. It's an exodus, it's an exodus back home.
How have you been spending this time of social isolation?
It has been pretty isolated, particularly being in the woods.
Oh my gosh, I believe it.
I've forgotten a lot of what socializing even means anymore. But, all the better.
Yeah. Well, and I have to say, you have this amazing Patreon account, so we've gotten little glimpses into how you spend your time there. There have been some pretty amazing live stream concerts, some works in progress, some unreleased material. Tell me, how are you marshaling the strength and focus to be putting so much out there?
Lack of choice? No.
Yes.
How am I?
The artist's plight in 2020.
Yeah. No, having Patreon has been such a lifesaver because all of my plans have been canceled. Everything that I was scheduled to do this year has been put on pause. So having Patreon has been this blessing where I have a place to put everything and to still communicate with fans and share things. So I've been very grateful for it. Do
you have any dates on the calendar, Nika, or are you holding off until we know a little bit more when things will reopen?
Yeah, all of my shows that I had booked for this year, which weren't even that many, but they've all been slated to happen in 2021. So I guess gotta wait till next year.
Listeners, definitely keep an eye on zolajesus.com to pick up tickets for that. You must see Nika live. In fact, my daughter, Conwy, who you've heard about a little bit on the show, her very first concert that wasn't a family member's show was Zola Jesus at Pitchfork, I want to say 2018.
Aww.
You're part of our family lore, Nika.
Oh, I'm honored.
Well, again, I really felt as if you have an understanding of the approach of these artists more than almost anyone else. Now, first off, Jehnny Beth. Nika, did you ever see Savages play?
I haven't. I've seen video of them, and it really is electric, even through YouTube.
Yeah, same. My God, it's like it's an assault. Her solo music is no different. Now, Jehnny Beth was born and raised in France. She moved to London as a teenager, and that's where she formed the all-female dark post-punk group Savages. They released 2 records, Silence Yourself in 2013 and then Adore Life 3 years later. Jehnny Beth went on to become a DJ on Beats One, where her show is called Start Making Sense. She's also an actress in French cinema, as well as a host on French television. Jehnny Beth has famously collaborated with the Gorillaz on their song We Got the Power, which also featured Noel Gallagher of Oasis, and she's worked with Julian Casablancas of The Strokes. Jehnny Beth's partner in both life and work is the multidisciplinary artist Johnny Hostile. Before Savages, they had a band called John and Jen, and Hostile went on to produce both Savages records, as well as provided photographs for the new book Calm. On her debut solo record, To Love Is to Live, which dropped just last Friday, Jehnny Beth has some other very cool collaborators. One of those collaborators was Idol's Joe Talbot, who listeners caught on the show just last month in a fantastic Q&A. But there are many more.
Romy of the XX is also featured on the record. The Dearest Romy, who I toured with years ago, and was produced in part by Flood, who I've also worked with in the past.
An absolute hero of mine, Flood is. I've never met him, but one of the first producers' names I knew as a little boy because of his work with Depeche Mode.
Yeah, and you too. And Nine Inch Nails' Atticus Ross also lends production, which is as incredible as any of the work that he's done with Trent Reznor.
This is a heavy-hitting squad.
It's huge.
From To Love Is to Live, let's check out the track Heroin.
All I want is to go dancing with the devil. All I want is to touch you on every level.
She's amazing.
Gorgeous. It reminds me of kind of like late era David Bowie.
Yes.
Really groovy, but also kind of like spoken word. I find it really, really captivating. Her focus on words, which they talk about a lot in the following conversation, is really inspiring as someone personally who hates words.
I'm surprised to hear you say that you hate words because your lyrics are gorgeous and heartbreaking and devastating.
Oh, thank you.
And seemingly very considered.
Yes, but they don't come naturally, I guess.
Ah, gotcha.
But these two, Jehnny Hval and Jehnny Beth, are just wordsmiths, and I really respect that. It's rare.
Nika, you mentioned that you've collaborated with some of Jehnny Beth's collaborators. I know that you are also a longtime friend and Sacred Bones family member alongside Jehnny Hval.
Yes.
When did you all meet?
We met several years ago, I think when Jehnny signed to the label, and I caught a couple of her shows and had some great conversations with her. We really connected, and I just have so much respect for her craft and her vision, which I feel like is so unique. I just feel like what Jehnny Hval offers to the artistic landscape and the creative landscape is really brilliant.
There have only been a few artists of the hundreds or maybe thousands that I've worked with over the years, both as a musician myself and then as a host, who I feel actually somewhat uncomfortable with because I see how fast their brain is moving and I cannot keep up. And Jehnny Hval is one of those artists. Do you know what I'm talking about, Nika?
I completely agree with you. Yeah. The scope of her imagination is so wide and with so much depth and idiosyncrasy that it makes me feel like a fraud.
That's it. That is exactly it.
It's harrowing. It's truly harrowing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it. Well, Jehnny's first novel, Paradise Rot, is a poetic look at queer longing and coming of age. I read it because I was a fan of her music. I had no idea what it was going to be about. And I realized the power that she wielded lyrically in her songs is magnified on the page. It just gives her so much more room to roam. And she has an upcoming novel, her second, called Girls Against God. That drops in late November. And the publisher Verso released this amazing teaser, which I just have to read to you guys. Or Nika, do you want to read this?
I would love to. A coven of witches curse contemporary Oslo. A group of schoolgirls get lost in a forest. A time-traveling Edvard Munch, the Norwegian painter behind the scream, appears in 1990s Norway. and joins a death metal band. Closely followed by the teen subject of his painting, Puberty, who has murder on her mind, awful things happen in Aspic. Jehnny Beth's latest novel is a radical fusion of queer feminist theory and experimental horror.
I am so fucking here for it.
Me too.
Jehnny's also been working on new music. Her track Bonus Material came out earlier this year. Of that, she says it's an Or do you want to read this, Nika? Do you want to read this?
Yeah, sure, yeah. Jehnny has just released a new track called Bonus Material, which is a gorgeous, ethereal musing with saxophone. Yes, saxophone. She says it's an unfinished track about unfinished substances leaking into one another. Trash practicing love. Well, I don't hear any trash on that track. Believe you me, I just hear a nightingale with
a saxophone.
With a saxophone.
Let's take a listen.
I love her voice.
Oh, incredible. And again, we talk about the conceptual nature of these women's work. I mean, she has thought out the concept of this track. She knows where she wants to go before she goes there.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
Are we intimidated? Slightly.
Yes.
Now, the two Jennys had a very open and frank conversation that I could have listened to for another 3 hours. We hear about their complex relationships with their countries of origin and the very powerful role of language in their self-identity.
Yeah, I mean, I found that aspect of the conversation really interesting because as someone who is a native English speaker and writes in English, I feel a disdain for my native language. But hearing them talk about the poeticisms within English and how they're able to express themselves more clearly with the language and more poetically, it made me have to think about English differently, but also I wanted to start thinking about how I can communicate in a second language.
That's really interesting because it made me think about the way that you've utilized Russian, which is your family bloodline, in your own work.
Yeah, and I think it's probably the same thing in a way where there's this detachment, but also this identity that allows you to express things in a more abstracted way. I thought that was really beautiful, but then also I appreciated how they connected on the feeling of following their own artistic threads that don't actually participate in the mainstream.
Exactly. These are artists that I cannot see climbing the charts, and it's because they're too much themselves. They're too weird.
Yeah.
And I say weird as the highest compliment possible.
Absolutely. There's something so beautiful about trusting the uniqueness of your voice and knowing that that is more palpable than reaching some sort of height in terms of external or material success. Mm-hmm. I respect that so much about both of these artists, that they're willing to follow their voice wherever it goes.
It was also cool to hear them give a parenthetical in the way they spoke about how Kendrick Lamar somehow brought all of the qualities that they try to work on in their own art into the mainstream.
Yeah, that is very interesting.
Which I agree with. I mean, he's totally done it. He is a very rare artist in that way.
Oh, absolutely. I appreciated and respected their ideas about how they cover or approach provocation and good versus evil, and how artists these days are expected to be these conduits for morality in a way. Mm-hmm. If they're constantly expected to be, you know, these moral beings, these angelic beings, that really reduces and narrows the scope of what we're able to tackle in our art.
As Jehnny Beth puts it, they're expected to have, quote, never-ending streams of compassion.
Exactly.
I loved that.
Yeah. You know, as an artist, you're a bit of a divining rod. You're an antenna for all of the emotions and feelings and experiences of human life. But those things aren't always good. And we shouldn't be expected to censor ourselves before it hits the page, because that is what art keeps. Art keeps all of the shades of human experience, good and bad.
I appreciate that all of the shades, good and bad, made it into today's conversation as well.
Yes.
Nika, should we roll the tape?
Let's roll it.
Hi, Jehnny.
Hi. How are you?
I'm okay. It's weird not to be able to see you, Jehnny, though, and speak to you for the first time, but where are you right now?
I'm in Oslo.
Okay.
At my home, which is looking terrible because I'm moving out.
Right.
So I'm just hoping that my recording doesn't get this horrible empty house reverb. But if it does, then I think maybe it's meant to be. It fits.
I don't hear the empty house reverb, and even if I
good.
did, I think it would be quite suited.
Yeah.
Onto the house reverb behind you.
Yeah. So where are you?
I'm in Paris. I'm at home as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been here for a few months now since quarantine started here in Paris, in France. But I'm all right. It's been a very sunny quarantine here in Paris, and it's been very strange. The city now, because the quarantine has stopped, so the city now is sort of getting back to normal. But for a while, it was very empty and very silent, which secretly I wanted to stay like that forever. Empty city, clean city, and quiet, and everyone was sort of keeping their distance, and which felt really nice. Which felt like the kind of city I want to live in, because Paris can be quite dense and intense, you know.
I've only a few times had a really good time in Paris. I mean, I've only been visiting, but sometimes it's been like way too intense for me.
Yeah.
But I've heard from people I know in Paris, and it seemed very different from here because we've never really been, like there's been no real quarantine here. Unless, I mean, if you've been sick, obviously you've been isolated. But we've been sort of advised to keep going outside throughout the whole process because it's good for your health. And I guess it's something we could do because we didn't have that many COVID cases, and because it's not a Paris type city. It's not, even Oslo is not that big. It's not that dense. So yeah, it's been all right here, but it has been very quiet.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the luxury of it being pretty quiet most of the time.
Can I ask you, what is your relationship with your country? Because from what I read, what you wrote, your fabulous 2 books, I think actually the second one hasn't been released yet. Am I right to think that Girls Against God is coming out?
Oh, did you get it?
Yes, I did.
Oh, wow. Because I
that
said,
good, or is that bad?
send it to her. So that's fabulous. You're fully updated. So, yeah, I mean, I have a complex relationship with my country, don't we all?
Yeah.
So I always wanted to really, really get away from where I grew up and maybe just, you know, in the entire Scandinavian zone, which I did. But at the same time, I mean, now I'm pretty happy living here in Oslo, where I'm from. So I've returned, and I'm quite loving like many things about being here. But I think that I needed to travel a lot and go to many other places to appreciate certain parts and tolerate other parts of where I come from.
Why do you think was this need to escape initially?
I grew up in a small town, and it just felt very, very small and intolerant. And I also fell in love with various forms of art that I knew that I would be quite alone with very early on in my youth. So it just didn't seem like there would be any room for me staying, and there wouldn't be any communication. Also, I had a complex relationship with language, which is why it's so interesting for me to read the translations of my work, because I have written these books in Norwegian, and then they've been translated.
Yeah.
And it's just been a real challenge to find my own writing voice in my own language.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I was actually going to ask you, because you're absolutely fluent in English, why you chose your native language.
Yeah, so the first book I actually started, I wrote quite a lot of it in English, and I don't think I could have written that book without writing in English. I started writing that, years ago, 2005 or something. And it was necessary for me to stay in touch with like the language I had encountered in a lot of different other works. So a lot of stuff I wouldn't have been able to read in Norwegian sort of was, like living in my head. Ways of communicating, ways of using language that I didn't know could exist in my own language because I'd been away for so long. So I started writing it in English, and then I sent it to a publisher, and they just told me there are no publishers who can work with English text in this country. And my first editor also told me that even though you can speak English pretty well, it is your second language. Your English is actually not that good. As a writer, there are so many things I didn't understand. I don't know if he was 100% right about that, because I love to read books written in English by people whose, English is second language. But I guess, he was half American, so it seemed like a valid point. So I struggled with writing that. But when I wrote the Girls Against God book, which was much later, I had a lot of fun with the Norwegian language. And because I was writing about Norway and Scandinavia, I felt like I was almost turning Scandinavia into like some kind of Austria, the repressed, the repressions of an IKEA country or something. It just felt right to use my Norwegian voice. But by then I was more comfortable with it. So yeah, it's taken me a very, very long time to sort of learn to express anything in Norwegian. But you are writing in your second language, or one of your languages.
I really connect with what you're saying about language. I think similarly to you, I think that's why our paths are quite... I don't know whose idea it was to get us together, but it was a great idea. Because I think there's a lot of similarities in what you're saying and your trajectory so far that I can relate to. Like, especially, I grew up in France, in a city that wasn't too small, but it was like a university city. And I was able to see gigs and have access to some kind of culture, but it was still very regional and regional-minded, if that makes any sense. And especially growing up with questions about, my own sexuality, I didn't want to be conditioned by my education, and I felt that there were some things that I couldn't express as a kid or as a teenager. So escaping, I really relate to that, because English, the language, was the first form of escape, because it was a language my parents didn't speak very well. It was the language of rebellion, because it was the language of punk music. And it was the first and the only language I learned to sing with. So when I was 8 years old, my parents introduced me to a teacher, like a music teacher. Who was a jazz sort of genius pianist. And he was incredible, this incredible Spanish man, actually. And he would teach me to sing all those jazz standards and teach me how to play them on the piano.
Oh, wow.
And every Saturdays, I have great memories of that. I remember food and music Saturday afternoons.
Yeah.
And so English became the singing language, and so I started writing my own things in English and be creative with that new language, which was why also I got good at it quickly. I know in Norway you have English pretty much, it's more accessible, it seems, or it's on TV. It's in France, it's nowhere. There's no, they're very protective here with the French language.
Yeah.
We don't really use English words in our own language, or the Academy of French, language is very careful on media, etc., to replace every English words by a French equivalent. And so I felt that English was sort of a language that could be, I could express myself and I could become someone else. So I sort of shaped a new personality with a new language. And when I went to London for the first time at the age of 15, I fell in love and I knew I was going to live there. I finally settled there completely at 20. And all my 20s from then on, I stayed in London, and I lived there and I became who I am now. And it's part of because I was able to have a clean slate in a way. You know, I could speak to someone, but they wouldn't be really aware of where I was coming from, what was my background, which you usually, you know, you can guess quite rapidly when you speak the same language and you come from the same country, you know. You could say, oh, you're from the south, you're from the north, you're from... But when I was in London, nobody could tell. And I felt that was very liberating.
Yeah. I remember when I moved to Australia, which I did in 2000, maybe because I was doing music, I would always adapt to the people's accent, like other people's accent.
Yeah.
And I was living with a bunch of people from southern England, I think, like Brighton area. And I spoke kind of like them for a while. I didn't even kind of notice. And then later on, I lived with Australians and got this kind of Australianish accent. But it was just marvelous that nobody could tell where I was from.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting, because I want to hear the rest.
No, absolutely. No, absolutely. I was thinking about what you just said. I think it's... especially when you're an artist, I think... I don't want to create cliches, but I think... You know, the 20s, you know, when you're 20 to 30, I think you're shaping your artistic identity. You're trying things and failing. I mean, you keep failing after 30, of course, but you know what I mean? It's like this sort of first attempts, and all these attempts are shaping who you become and what you want to say. And I felt that I didn't want to be determined by education, social class, or religion. And it was about putting down those walls that I had, that are necessary maybe for when you're growing up as a kid. And education is necessary, or, you know, but the fun of the 20s is to break them down, I think.
Yeah. And then you return to them afterwards, but a lot of people return to it all afterwards.
Yeah, and that bit that you just said really spoke to me as well, because going back, and I wanted to ask you, at what point did you feel, I'm going to move back to Norway? And I mean, I'm sure it was not all conscious straight away, but were you feeling unhappy, fragmented, or why did you need to go back to the roots, basically?
So I lived in Australia for 4 years. I finished a bachelor and I did this transitional year and I applied for a PhD. I did this kind of very quick, like I could sort of see my future. I was going to have a PhD in, I don't know, creative writing, or like, I didn't quite get there, which means that I moved back, like just as I got into a PhD, and I even got a scholarship. To my mom's horror, I moved back just when, you know, something was worthwhile, because my parents felt like they were very far away. I mean, that's probably much more noticeable when you are the parent than when you are the child. Because I just found, because I'm moving house, I just found this amazing folder. My mom had saved this folder of printout versions of every single email I sent to her while I was in Australia, because that's what you did in those days, you know? You still printed out emails to sort of,
you did.
Okay, well, what is this? It's a letter. I need to have it as a letter. I need to document.
As a letter, yeah.
Yeah. And she saved them all. So it was so sweet, because it reminded me how I did not understand how far away I was at all, even when I moved back.
Especially Australia.
Yeah. So far away. So I moved, I mean, it was partly because I got sick for a while, and then I sort of realized that, it's really difficult to sort of stay in another country and sort of have no family. I mean, that's difficult. A lot of people choose to do that, and that's really tough. Yeah. So I guess I was confronted with that, and also like this doing a PhD, or did I want to pursue arts? And then I sort of got into a writing school in Oslo that I thought would be more like set me on the path to be an artist, or like a writer of fiction, rather than going through the PhD system and being more of an academic. So I think that I those two things combined, this kind of and encountering my health, encountering the fact that I had aged 4 years, which was then kind of scary to me because I thought I would be 20 forever. Even though I was only 24 when I moved back, all of a sudden I felt very old, very vulnerable, and also very sort of on like having to choose between more of a career and having more freedom to develop some kind of artistic career out of what I had traveled into. So I think that's why I returned, and then it was kind of hard to go back to Australia after that. So I sort of left. I have 2 lives, and one ended at 24, I feel.
There's one part of your book on, let me know if I'm wrong, but there's this moment where you imagine the life that you have left continues on, and it continues parallelly to the choice you've made. So the choice you haven't made is still a reality that carries on. So you're still back there in Australia, becoming a teacher.
Yeah, the idea that time sort of goes on. I mean, I think that still is very strong with me, that you don't leave. Your choices kind of stay behind in you somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's very sentimental and unproductive, but I think that unproductive is kind of a very positive aspect of life.
I've had those thoughts when I was a kid, when I would be walking down the street and choosing to change pavement. And I would imagine that the me who didn't choose to change pavement was still walking on the other side of the street.
Yeah, I can relate to that a lot. All those like parallel Jennys. Well, we are now too, in name.
Yeah, and it's the idea that you're leaving a trace everywhere you go, you know, and I quite like that idea. Don't know what to do with it, but I like it. It's enchanting.
But you've also returned. So you're in Paris, which means that you have returned as well. Do you live there when there is not Corona times?
Yes, I moved back, I think 3 years ago, a little bit more than 3 years ago now. So I spent 12 years in London, and I was at the end of the tour I did with my band, Savages. And I was also touring with Gorillas around the world, and it felt at that point, I think everything was fine. I was having a lot of fun. I was doing a new radio show for Apple Music. I was meeting a lot of people doing that, and I was traveling with Gorillas, and I was having a good time. But I think I felt quite unhappy after, the end of the touring with Savages, and there were some, difficulties I was facing within myself, I think, that were getting bigger and bigger, that I couldn't really escape. And they were preventing me from carrying on just the way I usually did, So I hit that point and then instinctively moved to Paris. I mean, my partner, Johnny Hval, was already in Paris. He'd moved there 2 years before, so I was in London, he was in Paris. He'd got a studio here in Paris. So because I wanted to write new music, it felt, okay, I'm just going to move to Paris. We're going to move together again and work, with this great facility we have. And so there was like those practical things. But then I got into therapy, and I got into therapy in my French language, my native language, which I didn't really think about at first. But when I did the first session, I realized I'm speaking French about me. And it was so weird, because I felt suddenly I was using a language I left behind, and it was the language of my 17 years old, of me when I was 17, or because I didn't really spoke that language that much for more than a decade. And I always referred about me or had deep conversations in English. French had become this sort of secondary old language from the past, and even when I was going back to Paris or to France to see my family, I had an English accent. It was very pathetic, but there were certain words I couldn't say anymore in French, because I had abandoned it so much that I didn't want to have anything to do with it. So I went into therapy and then started reconnecting with the language. And parallel to that, I was writing my record, To Love Is To Live. in English, because singing for me is really English, and I'm sure for you too. But but then I was writing my book as well, Calm, and that I wrote in English, and I'm writing like another, probably a next book. I don't know exactly what it is now, but I still write in English. I still think it's a great, I'm not there yet. Like you, like to go back to being creative and really deep into my native language, but I think I felt fragmented. I felt there were parts of me that were not connecting anymore. There was the artistic me, the artist, the stage performer, and then there was me at 15 years old who went to London for the first time, and those two people were not communicating, and I had left behind my family. Like, I rarely saw my parents. So I think there was unhappiness, and sometimes unhappiness and friction is important. I mean, it's useful when you're right. But I felt I hit a point where it was sort of preventing me from going anywhere. If I wanted to progress in what I'm writing about, if I wanted to get to a different stage in my art, let's say, I felt I needed to sort out this connection and actually embrace me as a French person. Accept myself from being from that place, from those parents. I always admired, I remember, artists who could say, oh, my dad was this or my mother was this, and with a sort of a romantic nostalgia, I don't know, like, Tracy Emin or like different artists who I'd see interviews of, and it could be like retracing their origins, and you could feel there was a real embracing their roots and who they are. And I felt so not at that stage. I felt, don't ask me anything about where I'm from. I'm sort of suspending in time and in space, and I'm connected to nothing and no one. Which obviously cannot really sustain for very long, because then you sort of pedaling in the void, in the emptiness, and you sort of suddenly feel like you're going to fall.
But I mean, it's both something that I guess most people eventually face at some point.
Yeah.
Like, you can never really break away, but you can enable a voice. I mean, I just find it so interesting that you struggled with pronunciation. Because I find I'm a pronunciation nerd.
Right.
Aren't we all when we sing? Pronunciation is so primal to me. It's so instinctual, so much to do with it's subconscious. So it's just like a beautiful image, not being able to kind of sit down in your language or get the choreography of communication right. It's clumsiness.
Yeah, and I wanted to blur all the sort of signs of where I was coming from. So people thought I was English or were not sure. Still today, actually, journalists in France think I'm English. I mean, I was part of an English band with 3 English women, so I suppose there is an obvious confusion coming from that. But also I think I was consciously trying to blur the lines, and so now I feel better. I'm not where you are, like able to write in my own language, but I feel I've got to find this sort of parallel line where I'm actually connecting a little bit more with my country, even playing here more or doing more interviews here, or like things that are, allowing people to know me a little bit more. I've started a music TV show here in France where I invite musicians to talk and to perform on TV and have this moment where they can express themselves on stage and also with me and as a group, like we all talk together.
Wow.
But it's in English. But in the past, I would have not agreed to do this in my own country.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah, we don't really have anything like that here, I feel.
Nowhere. I mean, in TV is very hard on musicians, I think, and that's why I wanted to do it.
For sure.
We rarely sit them down and ask them to talk about culture, the world, politics and ideas, or even just to be funny and, entertaining people.
Yeah.
TV is reserved for, culturally, it's the cinema. And even when I did like TV with Damon Albarn, in the UK, so it's like his home country, he would play at the end of the Graham Norton show and then be asked to come to talk But at the end,
Yeah.
like for 5 minutes when it's
Yeah.
it's fucking Damon Albarn, you know what I mean? Like so it really struck me. I was like, what? It's so strange. Like, why is he not the first guest? Like, I don't understand. But it was an actress, or
Yeah. TV is just impenetrable. I don't understand it.
Yeah.
Here it's just, there's hardly any music at all on TV. And when you see people talk, it's almost as if it's social media, or it's like not even as clever as social media. There's a lot about, there are sometimes shows made about musicians, but it's all this kind of fandom, celebrity culture. Even if it's not on a scale like, with American artists and fans, it's still presented through that language. And this language I don't understand. That's one of the things I really struggle with being an artist in a field of work that contains live shows and appearances and being like slightly more visible than if I had been a writer of unpopular books and that was it. Because that is what I am when I'm a writer. But when I'm doing music, I'm seen by more people. And I'm not the kind of person who's very sort of comfortable with that. Because like in one way or another, it's a reminder of that. It's a mix of something very genuine that we all miss right now, which is, coming together.
Yeah.
And the incredible power of that. But also this kind of the way that the industry has sort of made it into, like, formed it into a celebrity culture rhetoric that I find very difficult to deal with. Even more, actually, when I'm confronted with other artists, which is probably why I've never tried to speak with you when we've played the same festival, because I'm always running away from other artists.
Oh, I'm quite the opposite. I run to artists a lot.
Oh, that's nice.
Because I feel that they are my family and they are the only people like actually feeling very comfortable with.
So nice.
They're the people who give me hope. And that's partly why I wanted to do the TV show, because sitting down with artists and hearing them talk, it just makes me happy.
Yeah, it is a family, for sure. I mean, that's a really sort of a beautiful idea that I wish, I'll try to learn from you. I'll think about that next time I meet someone and my body feels like it wants to melt. Yeah.
There was a question I wanted to ask you actually about, you as a book writer and you as a musician and performer. I wondered what came first, or which one would you think is defining you more, if any. But also if as a kid or as a teenager, did you want to be a writer first? How did the performance then came into your life, or was it first performance and then writing, etc.? What's the relationship between words for you? Like, did you need words when you were a kid more than you needed music, for instance?
Yeah, I did. I was very, very, very interested in music, and I wasn't really playing instruments when I was very young, but I was playing them in my spare time. I got a synth, and I was very drawn to it, but I was from a sort of a very early age, I was writing books. So I always wanted to be a writer. I felt like that was a life I could have. Or I didn't feel like I was so good at it that I could have, I didn't think about that stuff.
You mean a life of poverty and isolation?
Yeah. Poverty, isolation, quiet.
Yeah, quiet.
That's what I thought. I would live on a lighthouse and just walk around in the grass on the beach. Wow. And then I would write. Very silly, but that was my fantasy when I was 9 of my life.
Who were your favorite writers?
Oh, at that time, that was very early. So that, I guess, if you'd asked me at 9, it would have been one of those, would have been a writer of Swedish horse novels for kids. When I was a little older, I was thinking about Virginia Woolf. But I was also thinking that I would actually be in her books, even more than being someone like her. So it was very mixed up. I had no issues at that time with, I read mostly books written by male writers because that's most of what you could find. So I had no sort of, this was before I didn't feel like a very gendered person, especially with writing, which was for me an made me feel very, very liberated from all those like constraints of boy and girl that was so crushing for many of us, I think, you know, in our teens. So I had a lot of ideas about who I would be as a writer. I mean, I was playing music and I started sort of making melodies with some of the stuff I was writing. And then later on, I played in a band. I mean, I also went to a type of music high school, but I played the guitar, but I wasn't very good. But I think I had an idea that I could work with music somehow, that it could relate to the words. So that was more of I wouldn't say coincidence, but I never felt like I was going to be a musician. To me, being a musician had to do with skill, because that's what I learned in school, that, you know, first you had to just be skilled. You had to get the highest mark in all the sort of skill subjects and get into music schools based on your technical performance in the audition, that kind of thing. So I thought I would be like an academic writer, or like I would sustain myself being an academic and then I would write fiction. And then maybe I would do some music on the side. So now it didn't really turn out like that. But I've hardly ever been to a lighthouse. But yeah, it's interesting how music then became somehow easier for me, because maybe it was more free, maybe it was a simpler form, and maybe it was more intuitive.
Maybe also writing is something that comes with age.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I'm still mediocre, but I'm improving. With music, I feel like I'm too old. I mean, that doesn't relate to my songwriting. It relates more to the world that we're in, which is all about youth. Yeah. Youth is great, and, you know, time, every single moment of time always exists. But yeah, as a writer, I think you have more time in so many different ways.
Well, the characters in your books are young. The age is like between childhood and adulthood, you know, that awkward moment when you have to decide what you're going to do with your life. Yeah,
so I think in both of my books, I have dealt with at least partly young characters, because I've felt like I'm still kind of getting through those things that deal with defining who you are, or dealing with understanding who you are, and also where you are. Like, what is this country? What is this place? What is place? What is this mythology? What is happening? In the Girls Against God book, because I didn't live in Norway when I was older, and I've never returned to the sort of rural south that I grew up in, that book was sort of, it needed the younger character, slightly more angry than myself, although I think many people just think it's me, which is fine.
I was wondering.
Yeah, I think I like to write that way, in a more like you would write poetry, where it doesn't matter whether it's just you or whether it's slightly someone else.
It doesn't matter. I agree.
Yeah, I've needed to return to the age I was when I was living in that Bible Belt part of my country.
Yeah.
And it was really fun too, because then I could make her so angry.
Yeah, she's so angry. I actually felt it was really nice, because I think you write about anger and hatred really well. The way you said, like, hatred isn't subtle, but it's beautiful, you know. And it's kind of rare at the moment to see hatred being seen as a positive fuel. Because I feel, especially in popular cultures and, you know, music or otherwise, that everything seems so tamed, and it's definitely not a selling point. If you want to be popular, you have to sort of present yourself as someone who has only pure thoughts and wants the best for the world, and think of has so much empathy for every single individual that is that is living on this planet. And I can't help but think that it's there's a layer of hypocrisy in that never endless stream of compassion, And when I read your book, I felt relieved to find a character that suddenly could echo the sides of me, which personally I like to express in my work, on my record, To Love Is To Live. I think there's so much of trying to wear the mask of evil, and trying to embody those characters who suddenly are like, I'm evil too. I have those thoughts. They're shameful, but and obviously there's a link with religion. So that's another thing I want to discuss with you, because obviously in Girls Against God, it's very present.
Yeah.
And the idea of hating God. And there's a lyric on one of my songs, Innocence, where I say, and there's the guilt, of course, because I was raised Catholic and they teach you it's bad form to think man is a piece of shit. So it's this idea of, I wanted to write a song representing my feeling of emptiness and my incapacity to feel for the rest of humanity sometimes. And living in a city and feeling that my heart was so small, maybe too small, and there's only one or two people I could really care about, but the rest, they can all go to hell, and I have this sort of visceral lack of empathy, and then it goes away, and then it comes back, and then it goes away, and then it comes back, and I'm like, is this a feeling that defines me? Does anybody else feel that way sometimes? Like a sort of disgust, like even physical, about humanity, And the guilt, of course, of feeling that, because I was raised with these ideas of charity and compassion and caring for others, and this sort of also pressure of today's times, I think, to, as a performer, as an entertainer, as a front person, to care for every single person in the room when you're performing, which actually I do believe I feel at those moments when those people have come to perform for me. Actually, it's funny I said that, but they come to watch the performance and they care, and I care for them at that moment. But I don't have that. I struggle with that connection with the rest of my peers sometimes. So anyway, go ahead. If that's not really a question, but
I think that, the compassion, self-hatred, religion, it's so closely related.
Yeah,
it's insane how, and I find that, I'm at the moment I'm trying to write something critical, something that I don't know what it is yet. But it's with words, so it's on paper, and I'm sort of trying to say something about the dilemma of being an artist and being sort of forced to be all alone and on your own and taking all the responsibility and not being able to come together because you don't really see. I think that's the problem many times. We're forced into being freelancers. We're forced into taking on these. If you're going to be critical, then you have to be clean. You can't criticize something and then you've done something that's wrong. You can be cancelled. All this kind of stuff. That to me is due to an extreme lack of empathy that I find comes out a lot in our sort of distanced world where we can yell at each other online without doing the research, without looking at what a person is. And I sort of look for a way to be critical, but also be able to say, have a voice without being clean. And I think I started thinking about this because I was washing my hands so much.
That's a very beautiful way to put it. Having a voice without being clean, that's brilliant. That's exactly that.
Because isn't that what that's the only way to speak, to maybe admit, not even admit, because admitting, that sounds so sinful. And my very clever friend who comes from a at least partly non-Christian country was saying to me one day, this idea of blame and responsibility is so Protestant. She said, it could be easily as Catholic. But carrying all this stuff around and feeling like you have to be clean, it's very religious.
It is.
Even like me, I'm not religious. I don't believe in God. Not any God that I know of from my childhood, at least. So for me to realize that I am so religious when I look upon myself, like the self-reflectiveness that has managed to really take hold of me throughout my life, especially my upbringing and all those sort of traces of that. That view, I think, is really necessary to really look at if we are to succeed in any sort of coming together when we're so separate. I don't know if there's a way, but I'm trying to write something critical. I don't know what it will be.
The idea of the sin is what your friend told you, and it's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. And there's a song on my record called "We Will Sin Together," which people sometimes think I say "we will sing together," which I quite like that twist.
Yeah, that's lovely.
But the idea, I think, is to say that there's no right or wrong. There's only in and out, in the sense of there's no living without being wrong, and which connects with what you said about having a voice and not being clean necessarily. Because for me, that's what you require from politicians. But that's not what you should require from artists. And I think sometimes because maybe of this sort of shift into stardom or celebrity, which politicians have embraced, and that is also very present in the art world and music especially.
For sure.
Too. I think suddenly we're forced into that sort of being under the scrutiny of morality and, and who are you to say this? And you can't be a thinker without being sort of looked at with a massive enhancer and being criticized, as you said, for having a voice and not being perfect. And that's why I always felt that stardom and being a star is not for me, because I think with that comes a responsibility. I don't know if that's the right word, but more like a pressure to always pretend to be on the good side of the fence. And that for me is completely, every pores in my body say no. I cannot I cannot pretend, be in front of you and pretend that I only have pure thinking, and I'm full of contradictions. I'm a human being. I'm full of it's complex what's going on, and maybe that's why the art I create is maybe more difficult. It's not difficult, but it's more. You can't reach those sort of summits of popularity because it's complex. It's showing complexity. But
Absolutely.
Saying that, there were records that were showing a certain level of, that were layered, which went really big. And that's why I was really happy with Kendrick Lamar releasing To Pimp a Butterfly, because I felt that was the sort of record that was layered, that was complex, that mixed genres, that was free. And it's found its massive audience. So
yeah.
And I felt suddenly I could, like when I was 10 years old or 8 years old, and I was a big fan of very popular bands like, I don't know, Aerosmith or like something ridiculous like that. But when you're 8, you're into big, bands and U2 or, And suddenly I could again be part of a popular movement. I'm at Coachella and I can go see the headliner. And it felt great. It felt, oh, thank you, because I suddenly I don't have to like this sort of obscure band because that's the only thing that, that speaks to my soul. Of course, I still love the underground and etc. But it felt good, to suddenly not having to be part of something big, to love something that was part of the mainstream.
Yeah, that can be really amazing to go into that as well. There are these moments at something like a huge show where even people like me can feel like part of something. But I mean, many times when I watch mainstream TV or other sort of more manipulated settings, major action movies, that kind of thing, I feel very left out. But there can be like, maybe that's what music is for, these moments of someone, in a live setting being a person and being much more complex than well-edited Marvel movies can ever be, because they are, you can't really focus group that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we haven't talked about your book, and I've read it. I feel like,
Sure.
I have many things I want to ask you. This is your first book.
Yeah. First published book, yeah.
First published book. Have you seen yourself as a writer, like previously?
When I was a teenager, I used to write constantly. It was, I never really thought of myself as a writer, but I definitely did it all the time. And I was writing stories and what I called my first novel. You know, we always have that at 13 or something. And it had a title, it had everything. And I actually wrote 2 of those. And then it was not very good, I think. But I also kept diaries from a very young age until now. I definitely think I went into music for writing. You know, I mean, I always wanted to be on stage as to be a performer was part of who I wanted to become. Having watched so many rehearsals with my dad and playing in my dad's plays, and sort of being on stage felt very natural to me. But writing was the secret weapon. It was the way I could understand myself. And in my household, the words were never really spoken. Although it was a very open sort of theatrical crowd, and it was quite creative around, it was very difficult to relay emotions and to share with intimacy. So I think words were the way to keep control. The starting point of this book was photography. Yeah, when me and my partner, Jehnny Beth, moved to Paris, he picked up a camera and started taking pictures of me, but also of close friends, and then of people we would meet specially for this. And the subject of his photos were sexuality and intimacy and the body, and a certain type of, I guess, pornography, but not using that in a derogative way. Because I think some of the images can create arousal, or excitement or any. And I don't think that's a bad thing. So there was this sort of thing going on in my life, and all the pictures are anonymous, so you never see a face, which I think is very clever in a time of the constant selfie, where the face is everywhere. And what it created was a time and space, a bubble, where the people involved would start sharing their stories. There was a lot of trust and a lot of it's a complete relaxed moment where society, the outside world, was completely shut down, and it felt exactly the same feeling as when you're a kid and you have your friend coming over and you play together the whole afternoon and you're thinking you're spies and and the world is completely shut down. So it's exactly how it goes. There's this sort of bubble moment that we share, and that is fun and expressive, and that always feels very good. And so this is like a little community over the 3 years we've done that, traveling as well around the world. Pictures were taken sometimes in London or in LA, or depending where we were. And this community of people is what inspired me to start writing the book, because suddenly it was my relationship with Jehnny Beth as well that pushed me to write. I wanted to write about the kind of ideas we talked about together and the search for alternatives, the search for the kind of imprisonment that one can feel with the type of romanticism that is supposedly the only sort of archetype for relationships and love, and that can feel very suffocating sometimes. So it's trying to present alternatives for whoever is intrigued and interested, without trying to say that's what you need to do, because I think it's just a book. It's not.
Well, that's I mean, that's the beauty of that sort of voice. You can present alternatives. Yeah. And they don't even have to be alternatives. They can be concrete. Like, they don't have to be like, this is an alternative to. You don't have to be necessarily as angry as my character. You can be more explorative, like in your stories. Because I find that your book, on the one hand, it's got little narratives, but they also sort of create within themselves, like they relate very, very much to questions about sexuality, but they also relate to questions about imagination and also the images create also then this nice dialogue that kind of, for me, relates to the writing perhaps, but also just like the shapes and forms of language. So when I was talking about pronunciation before, one of the images from the book popped up in my head for some reason. I find that they relate to language and even singing very much. I don't see the images as being faceless. They're more like you can be, or you can join them, you know. It's like a body that you can link with or not enter, because that sounds very, in this context, it sounds very, not obsessive, but objectifying. But I mean, like it's an entry point to the imagination, which I find very sort of musical.
That's interesting. I definitely was cautious to not to have the least names I could. I think there's one name, there's Tanya, there's Vala, but most of the characters don't have a name. And also there's no place and no time, which maybe it's something that is part of writing a first book for me, in the sense of I dared not be too anchored into some kind of reality, which I think is something maybe I need to think about, because also not giving a name is not necessarily very respectful.
But a name is a Christian name. Also. Which is why my character in Girls Against God didn't have a name, even though I don't mind. Of course. I don't mind if people think so, but I didn't want a Christian name for the main character.
The idea of not naming, actually, I didn't notice, but in your book that she didn't have a name, it's actually true, and you don't necessarily need it. And maybe that's why I felt that it was you, because you merge very much with your character if the character doesn't have a name.
Yeah, I think also that's part of the reason, because I want to keep it in between. Just having a different name is also then saying, no, I'm just a writer here, writing about something that is not myself. So I didn't really want to. I mean, I'm not over that. I find it so interesting that you say it's a first book thing to not have a name. Maybe that's true. Maybe I'm always writing my first book then. But it is, I'm constantly thinking about this when I'm writing. I need a name.
Me too.
Things need to have names. There needs to be a place. And I remember this from writing my first book, that I had no names and I had no places. But my editor he didn't force me, but I think that he really wanted to have things very much more concrete than I wanted to, because originally the Paradise Rot novel wanted to be more like your book, wanted to be more like, not as erotic, but still kind of maybe rotic, as in rotting, and also erotic. But more like little tales from a nameless place with nameless characters that could be the same or different ones. I mean, it makes it sometimes, for some readers, very frustrating, because that's how you sort of, it's like gender. You need to see the clear gender of people. Otherwise, it's just so troublesome for a lot of people. Then they have to think so much.
Yeah, I struggle with gender sometimes. The Inverted Man, one of the stories is called The Inverted Man. She was a woman.
Yeah, that was beautiful.
She was a woman before, and then halfway through writing the story, I changed it to a man. And there's a story where I didn't choose a gender. It's the one called The Bitching. So there's no gender there, but he or she is wearing sort of lady outfit. So maybe, but you could still think it's a man. But for The Inverted Man, I was sort of writing the inverted woman. And then I figured that because this story was specifically about trauma, childhood trauma, then tagging along with you and shaping your sexuality and how your journey with that as an adult. I felt that was something that had been written a lot about, maybe more about women in the sense of traumatic, sexuality and, struggling with sexuality. And I felt that writing about that from the point of view of an heterosexual man maybe was helping a little bit more at breaking some of the perceptions of what an heterosexual man struggles with, or or never struggles with his sexuality, or could never have this sort of traumas or things to deal with, or things to solve, or a battle with his own sexuality. I think that's more like the point of view of the victim is more the woman or the homosexual man, or
Yeah.
So that's why I changed it. So the choices of gender was something I had to think about, but that you don't want to think about. And it really changed the point of view of your book, Paradise Rut, to think that you didn't want initially a place and a name, etc., and make it a little tale, because there is a tale element to your story for sure. It sort of stays in my mind as a place, and it's a place I can still visit, if that makes sense. Like the brewery is a place I can go to in my mind now, and I can see the wood and the maybe the damp and the mushroom in the bathroom, and I can see the place, and I love the books where it can be anchored somewhere like this, where you've lived by reading it.
Yeah. I always intended to have the place, like the house, to be as strong and present. It was more the name of the city, the name of the characters, and like this.
Yeah.
It was mainly the names and clear genders. I remember being very embarrassed when I had to invent names, because I always wanted to take them out. But I don't think it matters so much now. Yeah, I think it has to do with where I was at as a writer, and I guess it felt like names expose something, regardless of what they are, regardless of whether you know someone with that name or not. It's not about that so much. It's about, I named this. So, God gave names to all the animals. It feels godlike. And I don't want to be godlike as a writer. I guess I want a different role. So it has to do with those things, I think. With the inverted man, I kept thinking of the tarot card, the Hanged Man, of course. Because you can get it inverted in a tarot reading. Yeah, I dealt a lot with these archetypes for my album of last year, because I was going to do this cover art with an artist who would draw some kind of freeform tarot cards that were included in the LP cover, and you could push them out of perforated paper. So you can sort of use them, but there were only 8, one for each song. So I had to find 8 different cards that she could then transform into other more liberal cards. Yeah, so ever since I've been thinking of tarot cards a lot. So they appeared when reading. And also, I guess, because of the images, the photos. But the ending of The Inverted Man is really beautiful. This other character that is just appearing, this woman, right? Or is it?
Yeah. It's, the idea, I mean, I don't know.
It kind of merged really nicely with the trauma, with like previous sexual encounters. Like she or that person was sort of everything in the moment. She disappeared and her silhouette resembled something else. And then came the photograph, which then went onwards into being another silhouette. So it was a beautiful moment for me in your book.
Wow. I struggle with that ending. I mean, I didn't struggle, but I questioned myself of how I wanted to end this story. I think I wanted for the character to be able to not accept the help that this character was sort of bringing on the table, like a magical wand. Like, it's always the idea of if someone came in and said, I can cure all these things you've been struggling with for years, would you say yes, And I think the idea of not being able to keep what you gained from those traumas and from those struggles, they have become too much part of who you are, and you'd rather live with them than just become normal. And I think that's very much how I feel personally. I think that's probably one of the moments where I put a bit of myself in the characters. But then the character fades away in the sort of heated pavement, and the waves of that heat is sort of shaping the silhouette into as if the silhouette was upside down. So my idea of that, and I don't think people will see it, but my idea was that the person who came to rescue the inverted man used to be inverted as well. So I don't know. I was very into, the sort of magical realism of writers, South American writers, and like Borges or Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Or
I was wondering what, because you go from monologues to dialogues.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what happened to make you sort of split, because I'm always very interested in form. I mean, I've struggled a lot with what to do with
the form is the first. Yeah.
So how did that appear?
I agree. The form is the most difficult thing, and it's the thing you need to find at the beginning so you can write a book. I mean, personally, that's how I try to think about it. So I didn't have a form. I knew what I wanted to write about. Initially, I wrote an essay about sexuality and freedom. That was very personal, and then I felt that was too personal, and I didn't want to write an essay. I wanted to write fiction because I felt that fiction was more powerful in shaping people's minds and changing people's imagination. And by the work of imagination, you can change someone's consciousness more than writing an essay, So I went into fiction, and literally I traveled to Spain, to a village in Spain where I didn't know anybody, and I rented a place facing the sea, and I was like, I'm going to write, and I'm not going to think. I'm just going to put down a structure. So what I did is I wrote a number of chapters, characters, and then I started writing and let them speak. So the first story I wrote like that was A Debt to Pleasure, where there was this couple talking to each other, and then sort of the introduction of a third, and then there was a crowd, the judgment and the judge. And so my idea, I think that came from that structure, was the idea of Greek tragedy. So where you have the choir, coming in and talking about the action. And all the action is actually described in the dialogues. There's no didascalies. If a character enters a room, he says, I enter a room.
Yeah.
And I thought I wanted to have this sort of pure structure with a language that is quite antique, like quite literary, not conversational. Even though they're dialogues, they're not conversational.
No, because they don't seem like they're meant to be taken directly onto a stage and just performed like that in a modern, I don't know, not so modern maybe, but like realist theatre kind of way.
No, I don't think they are meant to be theatrical, even though they were inspired by theatrical work.
Well, there are many ways to make things theatrical, so that could have worked in many other types of ways. Yeah, maybe. But that was the starting point. And then I started writing more dialogues, and then monologues came in after that. And when I finished writing this book, I was in Greece. A friend invited me there in a house in front of the sea. And there was no electricity and no heating. And it was summer, and it was sort of a very rustic life. And I was writing all day and then seeing my friend in the evening. And then she told me, on Friday, or I can't remember the day, but they are showing Oedipus in the Greek theater. Oh, wow.
Like half an hour drive from here. Would you like to go? And I was like, my God, this is crazy, because it's the ending and the beginning sort of connecting together. So we went to see Oedipus in this antique, absolutely beautiful amphitheater on open air.
Wow.
And I felt, it was the perfect closure for finishing the book in that context.
Oh, amazing.
Voila. We've covered so much.
It's been
great.
Yeah, so amazing. I feel like writing now.
Yeah, me too. And well done for whoever thought about bringing us together, because I think it was a perfect match, and I had a really good time talking to you, Jehnny.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, and I love reading your books, and I feel very so much connection. So I'm very happy. Hope we can meet in person.
Yeah, because I have a lot more to ask you.
Oh, please, anytime. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure.
Take care. Bye.
Take care, Jehnny. Bye-bye.
Jehnny Beth, Jehnny Hval, thank you so much for joining us here on the Talk House podcast. Listeners, make sure to check out Jehnny Beth's To Love Is To Live LP and book Crimes Against Love Memories. And while we're waiting for Jehnny Hval's next book, definitely pick up Paradise Rot. I want to remind you all that the only place you are able to see Zola Jesus perform live in the year of our Lord 2020 is her Patreon account.
I also have an exclusive store on Patreon where I offer handwritten lyrics, t-shirts that aren't available anywhere else, signed prints, and a bunch of other things to help pay my bills while all my work is on pause.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, also you can check out a bunch of the stuff that I've done for Talk House, such as my podcast conversation with Sir Keith Zizier, and I've written some reviews for Bauhaus, Tricky, Tim Hecker, and many more. You can look at that over at talkhouse.com.
While you're there, check out Jehnny Hval's talk on Bjork's Volnikura, as well as our column, The Way We Get By, featuring Jehnny Beth, and why she reads a million books at the same time. And as always, when you're at the site, check out the events tab. The day that this episode drops, that's Thursday, June 18th, we'll be hosting a Talkhouse podcast live on Insta convo between Bartees Strange and Fusilier at 6 p.m. Eastern. Nika, I hope you'll be in the comments there.
I certainly will.
Throwing black hearts.
You know me too well.
Our researcher for today's episode was Samantha Small, and everyone that you've heard speaking has recorded themselves at their hashtag StayHomeStudios. Our producer is Mark Yoshizumi, and the Talkhouse podcast theme was composed and performed by The Range. Nika Rosa Danilova, aka Zola Jesus, I hope you'll join us again on the show sometime soon.
I would love to. Just call me up.
Yes. Till then, I'll see you on Patreon.
See you there.
Till next week, I'm Elia Einhorn. Peace. And calm.